So I'm going to turn the meeting over to our current president, Charlie Lloyd. Charlie, are you ready to go? I won't repeat that because I don't get it.
Said it's a 4-pound problem fat. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're glad to see you here. I think I'm going to ask Chris to make your announcement first. Would you do that? Your speaker next week, next month. I'll give you the speaker and you can share it with the group.
Hi everyone, welcome. Our speaker next month will be a man named Chester Cott, C-O-T-T. He was a World War II bombardier, World War II. He went on about 35 combat missions. He's now 98 years old, so he's still going strong, and I'm talking a lot to his daughter. He now lives with his daughter. She helps take care of him and everything, but he'll be coming also with Stephen Shaw, who's a Vietnam era veteran, to help be on stage with him and help, ask questions and stuff like that. Then in March we have a man named George Colburn, was here how many months ago, Charlie? About 3 or 4 months ago? Okay. And he's a filmmaker. He's written put together a documentary on Eisenhower and one on the Code Talkers, World War II Code Talkers, Navajo. He'll be speaking about Navajo Code Talkers and also screening his documentary on that as well for us. Okay, anybody else I should bring up, or just next couple? Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. We've got some good people here doing a lot of work. I'm not one of them, but they do. Chris is our historian, Dr. Huffman, and he's got us booked up into September?
Next
July. When I was doing this, it was like month-to-month panic trying to get a World War II veteran. He's done an excellent job. And for that, we thank you, Chris. We have a special guest tonight, and I guess you've all seen that. And we're going to have a special introduction on our guest from our illustrious founder, Mr. William S. Jackson.
Thank you, Carol. This is a pleasure for me. Our speaker tonight, Dr. John C. McManus, he and I have spoken on the telephone a number of years ago when I was editor of the Timberwolf Howl, the newspaper of the 104th Infantry Division, and was researching General Terry Allen of the 1st Division and then of the 104th Division. Still hoping, as John encourages me, to get a book on General Allen out. But tell you a little bit about John. He has 2 degrees from the University of Missouri. He got his bachelor's degree in sports journalism. Then he wised up. And then he went back and got his master's degree in American history. And then received his PhD in American and military history at the University of Tennessee. He is presently Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at Missouri University of Science and Technology in St. Louis. He has a national reputation as a military historian, author, and professor of military history. And he recently completed a stint as visiting professor in military history at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. He has authored 13 books of military history, covering topics from the War of 1812 through World War II in Iraq, including titles on the U.S. infantry soldier, D-Day and the Normandy invasion and its aftermath, the American participation in Operation Market Garden, the 7th Infantry Regiment from the War of 1812 through World War II, Korea, and up to the present. And I've got to find out, John, why you have this special thing about the 7th Infantry Regiment. But I particularly enjoyed his volumes, The Dead and Those Who Are About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach, September Hope, The American Side of a Bridge Too Far, and Alamo in the Ardennes, the untold story of American soldiers who made the defense of Bastogne. Those books are of special interest because, number one, I'm a proud veteran of the 1st Infantry Division. And secondly, as some of you old-timers here know, Major Dick Winters of Band of Brothers, resident of Hershey, was a friend of mine for 25 years. Dr. McManus will turn his interest tonight. Oh, it's not there anymore. There was a picture of his latest book on World War II, where he's changing his interest to the Pacific War, which is the topic of his latest book, Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War, 1941 to 1943. Well, that doesn't finish it, does it? So guess what? There's going to be a second volume, which is going to take it through the end of the war. Right, John? Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. John McManus.
It just occurred to me, I don't know if I have a... Oh, how to get it to me there. You know, I went up to the pulpit here. Those who know me well would be shocked that I never end up addressing anybody from a pulpit in a church. So, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'd like to thank, of course, Charlie and Chris for doing a lot of the heavy lifting over these last few months to make this happen. But I'd also like to thank all of you for making time in your schedules to come here and hear my talk tonight. But beyond that, I'd like to thank you for establishing this organization and making it thrive and prosper. Anything that leads to the furtherance of our understanding of World War II, the seminal event in human history, in my view. Anything that allows us to understand that better, I just think is wonderful. So I really appreciate and applaud what you are doing here, and I'm extremely honored to come here and be a part of it. So what I'd like to do tonight is maybe bring the Pacific War to life for you a little bit, particularly the American experience, and maybe revise our view of World War II, provide a sense of how the Pacific has shaped our world today, so that we can learn from the history. It's a war that plays out over about a third of the world's surface, an enormous operational area that is so vast that American planners had to divide it into sub-theaters, partially as a compromise between the Army and the Navy, so they didn't strangle each other out there over who's going to have control over the Pacific War. But really, to a great extent, because of the vast geography, too. And you can see in this map, it shows you how the Americans are going to sort of split up responsibility. So in the Pacific, in Asia, you could not have one central commander the way you will, say, with Eisenhower in Europe. It's just a completely different animal. And even more than that, I wanted to address our sort of popular perception that I still see, sort of lingering on today, that the Marine Corps fought the entire ground war in the Pacific, and the Navy did the rest, and the Army had no role. And I've had some interesting experiences in this regard that kind of led me to write this 2-volume series about the Army in the Pacific Asia theater, in that I've had a lot of conversations with people, including one very recently in the last few months with somebody who was extremely knowledgeable about World War II and about the U.S. in World War II. And I was telling him about my research project and about Fire and Fortitude, and he kind of stopped in the middle of our conversation. He told me, he said, until we talk now, I didn't even know the Army fought in the Pacific. I thought, if that's true for a guy who really does not know World War II, I got my work cut out for me. So I thought that maybe it might be useful to give you a sense too of why the Army has been shrouded in that kind of obscurity, and I think there's several reasons. For one, the Germany First policy that FDR and Churchill had agreed upon in World War II certainly orients our focus at the time, and I think historical focus ever since, on the European theater, quite understandably so. And I'm not necessarily disputing that as an unwise policy, but naturally I do think that history follows what the focus was at the time, and we tended to sort of orient in that direction. The maritime nature of the Pacific theater, one glance at the map gives you a sense of this. The vast ocean, of course, everything is dependent upon naval power. I would not begin to argue otherwise, and certainly air power as well. So obviously, the naval leaders, most notably Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, are going to think of this as the Navy's theater, and with very good reason. And I think we have tended to sort of linger on in that thought process as well. The complete domination of General Douglas MacArthur in sort of shaping the narrative of the Pacific Theater in World War II, sort of shunting to the side that he had soldiers under him, and that he was sort of the best hero controlling the whole theater somehow. I think that he has sort of sucked the oxygen out of the room in that sense, of the larger sense of story. Unbalanced press coverage. It was just easier with a lot more infrastructure to report on the war in Europe. To get news transmitted that way. It was much more modern, there was more infrastructure, there was more assistance in place. It was a lot easier to report on than in so many inhospitable areas throughout the Pacific. And so historical coverage also follows the journalistic coverage to some extent. The trouble and brutality and savagery of the Pacific War, including the racial enmity on both sides, is not always that pleasant for Americans to remember. And what is, I think, though, important to recall, is that the fighting in the Pacific is really a harbinger for pretty much all subsequent U.S. combat since, much more so than the nature of the fighting in the European theater. And of course, the humiliating nature of the early defeats that the United States suffered in 1941 and 42 is not always a lot of fun to think about either. And finally, the exotic alien locales. Think of it this way. You're a World War II interested couple thinking about summer vacation. Well, honey, where should we go this summer? Vella La Vella or Normandy? Kind of hard to decide which one, right? I think Normandy's winning out on that, isn't it? So, yeah, I mean, of course, our attention is focused in other areas. But in truth, 1.8 million Army ground soldiers served in Asia and the Pacific. And that, by the way, does not include the Army Air Forces, which, of course, is part of the Army in World War II. I'm just counting Army ground forces and Army Service Forces. So that is the third largest armed force that this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war. Behind only the World Wars I and II Army in the European theater. So this is a massive story. To give you a little perspective too, the Marine Corps carried out 15 amphibious operations in the course of the war in the Pacific. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone carried out 35 in a 5-week period in the spring of 1945 in the Philippines. The Marine Corps mobilized 6 full divisions. It's the largest the Corps has ever been. The Army mobilized 21 combat divisions in the Pacific, plus several other regimental combat teams, engineer special brigades, tank battalions that comprise the equivalent of several more divisions. So I guess I'm speaking up here for guys like this, these poor schlubs who served in remote jungles around various parts of the Pacific. The average Pacific Theater GI, we didn't really have the good fortune of, at least in posterity, of fighting on a famous battlefield like Normandy, like the Ardennes, or Holland, or wherever else. They fought just as hard, if not harder, generally in a much tougher environment than most in the European theater. And I think it's important to remember the war just for its own sake, but also because it helped shape our world today so dramatically, and so many lessons that come out of it apply to our subsequent American military history and the kind of wars we fought ever since. In fact, the vast majority of our fighting has happened, post-war fighting, has happened somewhere on the Asian continent, with the exception of Somalia, with the exception of an invasion of Grenada, Panama. All the rest of it has taken place somewhere in the Asian landmass. And I also want to hasten to say, my purpose is not at all to denigrate the Marine Corps and its contribution to World War II, quite the contrary. In fact, what you see when you study the Army's role in the Pacific is you get a sense of the incredible contributions of the Marine Corps to victory in World War II. With a small group of people doing so much of the fighting as it did. But the Marine Corps was not designed as a kind of larger multivariate organization that could deal with logistics, that could deal with engineering to a large extent, and I'm talking about port battalions and that kind of thing, of major base development, aviation engineers and the like. The Marine Corps was designed as a lean combat force. The Army was broader than that with a lot of other military occupational specialties. So I would also like to demonstrate when the two ground-oriented services fought together, side by side, the good and the positive aspects that come from that when they work together well. And nonetheless, it would show you that the Army really did the vast majority of the fighting and the dying when you look at the broader scale. So happily enough, for a historian approaching this topic, of covering, situations like this. Doesn't look terribly appealing, does it? That's because it's not. I was amazed to find there's this incredible richness of source material. So it's sort of a sweet spot for an historian when you find the story has not really been told. It's really an aspect of World War II that hasn't been covered that much, and we need to understand a lot more, and yet there's an enormous amount of source material to help bring it to life. And I won't bore you with all the ins and outs and nitty-gritty sort of inside baseball details of that. But one of the things that I think really helped me flesh this out was some of the Japanese perspective, because I hope to provide not just the point of view of the U.S. Army, but also the people they were fighting. Many of whom, of course, did not survive those particular battles. So how can we do that? Well, Japanese soldiers in World War II, to a great extent, kept diaries. And of course, since capture was sort of unthinkable to them, the Japanese Armed Forces had no sort of specific protocol or training to prepare the possibility for their soldiers being captured. And of course, this meant that they didn't have any kind of security restrictions on diaries, as the U.S. Armed Forces did. You were not supposed to, technically under regulations, keep a diary of the U.S. Armed Forces. Many did, of course, but you weren't supposed to, because the enemy could get the diary and use that for intel purposes. Well, the Japanese had no such restrictions. So a lot of these guys keep diaries, and then they're captured by Allied soldiers. The diaries are, even though the Japanese soldiers had been killed, and the Army had this massive office called a translator interpretation section, and they translated into the material into English, and presto, you've got some incredible on-the-spot diary material, inner thoughts from Japanese soldiers. So I was able to use a lot of that. And the scope of this first volume begins with the Army's experience in Pearl Harbor. Of course, the Navy was the main target, the fleet. Everybody else was just kind of in the way. And this is true for many of the Army soldiers, like at Schofield Barracks and the like. So it starts with that experience, and it goes all the way through the end of 1943, the invasion of Macon and the Gilbert Islands, which is, of course, much lesser known than the more famous invasion of Tarawa at the same time, but they're part of the same operation. So in between, you see, of course, a lot of combat and the development of amphibious warfare. But you also see battles with disease, you see issues of sexuality, race, senior level leadership, so much more. So it brings out this vast, incredible human epic. And that's really what interests me as a historian, the human story. Not necessarily the dry as dirt bureaucracies and things like that, but the human story. What was it like for these people? How can we learn from this? What are they about? And what does this mean? So you see the Army evolve from a kind of inward-looking, almost provincial force to this massive, complex military force capable of carrying out really complicated modern operations. And you see these different themes and harbingers arise as you see the various chapters unfold in the story of this battle or that logistical challenge or this general or whatever. You see these kind of legacies and harbingers that are still with us today. I mentioned one a moment ago, the savagery of the fighting foretold the American future from Korea to the 21st century. Almost universally, America's enemies since World War II have fought more or less like the Japanese, with no sort of rules or compunction or restraint as Americans would see them. The Geneva Convention, the like, that kind of thing, the terrible treatment of POWs, and POWs are a big part of the book as well. And then it also it kind of forces the Americans to come face to face with their own moral quandaries and their own hypocrisies at times and their own challenges to how they're going to live up to their standards or whether they should, and how that has an application in a combat setting or doesn't, what you're after, what the rules of engagement would be. All these kinds of things come into play. And so the savagery of the Pacific War is very much a harbinger, very troubling one of what you've had ever since. Most of the fighting and most of the dying tended to happen on the ground. Even in such a vast maritime war and aviation war as the Pacific Theater, the vast majority of the fighting still took place on the ground, and this has been true ever since. 90% of American war deaths since World War II have been in ground combat. And most of those have been among Army ground soldiers. So there is another harbinger. The importance of understanding of culture to have influence. You already see in World War II American soldiers functioning in a kind of role similar to what special forces and special operations units are going to do in the future. Working with local guerrillas in the Philippines would be an example I would give you. Understanding how to have influence culturally in the South Pacific with various ethnic groups on South Pacific islands. How to have influence in China. Deal with local culture in China, in Burma, India, wherever it would be. You see this also, this harbinger. The vital importance of inter-service coordination. You see all sorts of problems, but also a lot of them working well together. And you can learn lessons for that, whether it's Navy to Army, Army to Marine Corps, whatever it would be. Working with allies. The frustration of having allies. You know, the last war we fought of any size without allies has been the Spanish-American War. And so the Pacific War, though of course it's dominated by the Americans, nonetheless the Americans are working with a lot of allies, most notably the Australians, who did really most of the ground fighting and dying in 1942 and 43 in the South Pacific, and who functioned as the main base for the Allies in their counteroffensive against Japan. Of course, working with allies like the British in Asia, but also, most importantly and most tragically, Chiang Kai-shek's China. One of the most ill-fated alliances in American history, and one that has really eerie overtones of what the Americans are going to experience later with the South Vietnamese regime in Vietnam. You also see, of course, the Pacific War awaken just this massive kind of post-colonial, non-white nationalism that the United States and its allies could not hope to control. So there are many harbingers for the future, and of course, helped lead to subsequent American wars in Asia, most notably Korea and Vietnam. So, as you can imagine, there's a lot of battles, there's a lot of personalities, there's a lot of issues we can discuss tonight. To get a full appreciation, of course, you have to buy the book and read it. It's always my agenda, you know. But, you know, I don't think it'd be, see if I'm wrong, but I don't think it'd be a lot of fun if we all just sort of read the book tonight together in unison. So what I'll do is I'll just boil it down, a few aspects of it for you that I think maybe give you the whiff of the book and the whiff of this larger story. So, let's start with the sort of massive elephant in the room. Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is a man whose ego, on a good day, might have fit into the Grand Canyon, maybe. On a good day. Douglas MacArthur had been around the block by the time World War II came upon us. Of course, he was a West Pointer. He was the son of a general, a Civil War hero, Arthur MacArthur, who had gotten the Medal of Honor for valor in the Civil War. Arthur had retired as a 3-star general. His great disappointment in his military career is he didn't become Army Chief of Staff, the top job. He had served as the American commander in the Philippines, thus beginning a long line, a bond between the MacArthur family and the people of the Philippines. Of course, Douglas had inherited this from his father. He had served in the Philippines as a young officer fresh out of West Point. He had served in World War I quite valorously. He had served as superintendent of West Point, modernizing West Point like no one else had ever done before. And he had, of course, become a young Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s. So he'd done it all. And he's leading the Army by the mid-1930s. The Roosevelt administration didn't really want him as Chief of Staff that much anymore. And he gets this offer to go back to the Philippines to help create their armed forces. And he jumps at it for a lot of reasons, but partially because he loves the archipelago and he understands the American government is about to give the Philippines its independence, and he wants to help them build armed forces that will help them defend themselves. And so he goes there as this sort of field marshal of this sort of paper army. He has this obscure aide, I don't know, maybe you've heard of him though, Dwight Eisenhower, maybe. Went on to some other things, I don't know, we can study that. But Eisenhower was one of his key aides and became so fed up with MacArthur by the end of his tenure in 1939 that he was only too happy to get out of there. So why? MacArthur had this sort of prevailing characteristic of massive egomania and a tendency to not always be in touch with reality. Someone who was convinced of his own genius, though, and wasn't always right. I think when we look at his campaign in 1942, this is only my opinion, and it's part of the fun of history, is debating these kinds of things, so this is only my take on it. I'm not advertising a last word or anything, but I think seldom in American history has a commander so badly mismanaged a campaign, and yet been perceived by his countrymen, certainly at the time, and by some of them ever since, as a great battle captain, maybe even a genius. You don't see a lot of that in this campaign in 1941-42. Now granted, he's in a tough spot. He spent several frustrating years trying to build this paper army out of almost nothing. It's a glorified sort of militia force that's sort of divided by the inherent problems of the archipelago. It's so multicultural. It's 7,000 plus islands. It's bunches of different languages. So we might serve in a typical Filipino army unit under American auspices, and say in a company of about 80 guys, we may have 6 or 7 languages represented. You know, and who knows how many different ethnic groups. That's a tough thing. You know, so he's got that. He's underfunded. It's underarmed. He's dealing with the nascent Filipino government, his old friend Manuel Quezon, who are sort of quasi-supportive but not. And of course, the American nation has not at all prepared for this war that's looming. And Japan has greater advantages in sea and air power and preparation for war. And of course, the Japanese are right next door to the archipelago, for the most part. So he's got a tough go. I think we would all realize that. But he doesn't necessarily come up with a very good concept. The War Department, in planning for the possibility of war with Japan, had anticipated that the Japanese were almost certainly to get troops ashore in the Philippines, especially the main island of Luzon there, which I should use the pointer to show you, right up here where Manila is, Manila Bay, and the sort of dominant culture in the Philippines. And they said, okay, we're going to get ashore, so what we're going to do, we're going to retreat our guys to the best and most defensible ground, the Bataan Peninsula, right there. A lot of high ground, a lot of ridges. You can fortify there, and you'll wait for the Navy, for the fleet, to fight its way to you in this general engagement with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Then you'll reinforce and you'll push them back out of the archipelago eventually. That's called War Plan Orange. You can't hope to defend everywhere in the beaches. Just look at the map there. How could you defend all the beaches that an enemy could land in? MacArthur rejects this and says, no, we can't. We're going to defend all the beaches. We can do it. We can stop the Japanese right at the waterline. That's what we're going to do. So I'm scotching War Plan Orange. This is a kind of disastrous decision that has terrible consequences. He discusses his strategy with a reporter at the time, and it's really interesting, this analogy he uses. It grabbed my attention. Bill had mentioned I was a sports journalism major in undergrad with a particular interest in baseball. And MacArthur loved baseball. He played at West Point. And he's talking with this reporter about his concept, and he says, my concept is hit them where they aim. And if you think about it, if you flip it around, the Japanese could do the exact same thing, couldn't they? If you're trying to defend everywhere, couldn't they just come ashore where you're weakest and sort of hit them where they aim? And this is precisely what happens. But it's also predicated on another disaster that happens within the first 24 hours of the onset of war. MacArthur loses about half of his strategic air force on the ground, mostly, to devastating raids at Clark Field and other places. And what this means is that the Japanese are going to control the air and the sea, which means they're probably going to be able to get troops ashore anyway. And it means they're going to be able to constrict any resupply to the islands and all sorts of really bad stuff. Okay, so this is the way it goes. Then they get ashore, and the whole post-War Plan Orange thing unravels. To MacArthur's credit, he realized by about Christmas 1941, this isn't working, so I'm going to go back to War Plan Orange and try and withdraw my people to Bataan, and that's what he's going to be able to do with the bulk of his army, but not all of it. But I mentioned terrible consequences. The army's food depots were scattered all over Luzon and elsewhere. Because you were going to defend everywhere, you had to put your logistical sinews out there in all these places you were going to defend. Whereas previously, it was all going to be stored in Bataan, and you would have bought yourself a lot of time to hold out there. Now you don't have that time. So most of the food, unfortunately, had to be abandoned in this headlong retreat. Example, 10 million pounds of rice at Cabanatuan, which is like in central Luzon, right in the heart of the island there. President Quezon had ordered to remain in place so to feed the population. MacArthur would not countermand him, and he couldn't get the rice to where it needed to be in Bataan anyway. He would not even authorize the appropriation of thousands of cases of canned food on the docks of Manila in Japanese warehouses, Japanese-owned warehouses. He would not even, authorize that to be moved to where the army was going in Bataan. By the time the army got to Bataan by, say, early January 1942, and by the way, they're facing a Japanese army that's half their size. MacArthur had tried to promote the idea that he was facing vastly outnumbered and all this sort of sheer nonsense. The Allied armies outnumbered them by a factor of 2 to 1. So by the time he gets to Japan, to Bataan, his quartermaster estimated the following. The Army had 30 days of rations left, 50 days of canned meat or fish, 40 days of canned milk, 30 days of flour, 30 days of canned beans and tomatoes, and 20 days of rice left. It wasn't going to last very long. You thought, what about local food sources? Yes, they're slaughtering about 30 to 40 animals per day. They've got an abattoir set up. But what that boils down to, because you've got an army of about 80,000 or so, it's about 6 ounces of meat per man per day, maybe. What about fishing? They tried that for a while, but Japanese air negates that because they're just shooting up those fishing boats, so that severs that. Plus, you have the local population that still has to eat, and this Allied army is bigger than anyone had anticipated at this point. So the troops are soon on 1/2 and then 1/4 rations, and yet they fight very well. The Japanese really do not best the Allies tactically at Bataan. They win because of logistics more than anything else, because the Allied soldiers were just so hungry, and in many cases were investing most of their time and energy in trying to find food. And just did not have the energy to fight as much as they could. So the Japanese suffer many tactical reverses there. This army fight pretty well. It's a unique army in American history that it's a colonial army. It's about 70 to 80% Filipinos under the command and auspices of Americans. Almost like that British model colonial army in that sense. So the Japanese have some pretty rough times there. And at times they lose people who were cut off and annihilated by the Allies. And here's where some of the diaries come into play. One Japanese army doctor who knew that his unit was cut off, and he says, I made up my mind I will not have a disgraceful ending. I went back to my patients and told them it is better and more honorable to die with a pistol shot than to be captured. And that gives you a little insight into generally how the Japanese are going to fight in this war and how they viewed things. MacArthur makes the mistake of telling the starving troops that help is on the way. A lot of food, a lot of reinforcements. Here's the communique. Thousands of troops, hundreds of planes are being dispatched. The exact time of arrival is unknown. They'll have to fight their way through. But it's imperative our troops hold until these reinforcements arrive. He knew this was not true. Okay, so the troops, some of them getting their hopes up, some of them didn't believe it, some of them lost faith in MacArthur, many did not. And what's interesting about this guy, yes, what he does there is wrong. But he's on Corregidor, which is a fortified island in Manila Bay, of course. And he's comporting himself with tremendous valor. He loses 25 pounds during his time on Corregidor, so it's not like he's eating lavishly. And he is kind of an inspiration to many of the soldiers around him with how he deals with the constant pounding from Japanese air raids and shelling and that kind of thing, too. But the other thing, too, with him is his young wife, Jean, whom he had married 5 years earlier, and their young son, Arthur. And this is another insight into MacArthur, and I think one of the sort of constancy in his character you'll see throughout much of his career, even when he was a junior officer. When at one time he refused an assignment. He had orders for the assignment, he didn't want it, he just refused to go. And he just sort of waited him out with this test of wills, and then he got the job he wanted. Okay, later, when he's in command of the Allied military forces in the Philippines, in May 1941, the War Department understood war with Japan was probably imminent, and they ordered all dependents out of the Philippines. So that meant everybody, except Jean and Arthur. So why didn't his family leave? Because sometimes the rules didn't apply to him. Now, no one is going to convince me that this isn't going to affect his outlook somewhat as he's commanding troops in Corregidor. If you have your wife and your young son with you and they're in a war zone, certainly this is going to affect you and how you operate. There's no question about it. It's traumatic for them. And of course, it ultimately leads to the concern over what happens if the Japanese capture them. What are they going to do to Jean MacArthur? What are they going to do to the kid? You know, all this kind of stuff is happening. These are the permutations of people back in Washington wondering what to do next. At the same time, the American people had needed a hero in the midst of all this terrible news, and so MacArthur's that hero, and partially because the communiques he's sending out make it seem like he's at the front lines of Bataan. We historians can only document one visit to Bataan, and this was in a non-combat setting, and when fighting was not necessarily going on. He's in combat at Corregidor, but he's not on the front lines of Bataan. So it's always like, he's this, but not that. That's sort of the story of MacArthur. Well, as you probably know, FDR orders him out in late February 1942. He waits for about a week or two before really complying with the order. He's ambivalent about not, he doesn't want to leave the Philippines. He doesn't want to leave his soldiers who he cares about deeply. But he ultimately decides to follow this order. And you end up with this clandestine mission, of course, with 3 Navy PT boats, getting him out, and of course with select members of his staff. That gets him to a B-17 farther south in the archipelago and eventually to Australia, where he famously, of course, says, "I shall return." Of course, the proper word always being the personal pronoun. That's my card. He accepts a personal payment from Manuel Kazan of $500,000, even though he was an active duty Army in the United States, active duty officer in the United States Army. His staff members, 3 of them, also accepted money. This was not known for years. So there were some less than honorable aspects of this. He also gets a Medal of Honor, which I think many historians view as more political than about valor at that point. There were plenty of times in MacArthur's career when he could point to tremendous valor. This wasn't necessarily one. So Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, of course, then has to take over for him. Another son of a soldier, son of a cavalryman, and Wainwright, of course, famously eventually has to surrender the Filipino-American forces in the archipelago. This is in May and June 1942. Before that, interestingly enough, the Bataan forces collapsed on like April 8th, 9th, right around that time. And they were under a major general named Edward Ned King. What's interesting about him, King was a Southerner, and he did not at all believe in racism. He did not believe in segregation. He did not believe in Jim Crow. And he would brief his officers who came to the Philippines and said racial superiority is nonsense. And he would start from that standpoint. And yet he was also a son of the Civil War in the sense that he had been steeped in that tradition. And so as he goes to surrender to General Hama that day, very foremost in his mind, of course, were Robert E. Lee's famous words, "I must go to General Grant, and I'd rather die 1,000 deaths." It kept going over and over in King's mind that day. And it was almost 77 years exactly to the day after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. So it's left to King and Wainwright, in a leadership sense, to hold this bag now of entering into captivity of the Japanese. 21,000 Americans and about 4 times as many Filipinos now come under Japanese control. And by and large, the Japanese treat them with neglect, cruelty, outright brutality. You have the infamous Bataan Death March, of course, which, by the way, is not a sort of organized single column. It's staggered columns of people captured and moved in various circumstances and various levels of treatment all the way up into the central part of Luzon. And that goes on April and May 1942. It leads to the deaths of about 600 Americans and about 5,000 to 10,000 Filipinos. The Filipinos get it much worse than the Americans, really. And I think when you look at the issue of captivity, I think one of the best and most interesting ways to study it is through the experience of this man. This is Harold Keith Johnson, U.S. Military Academy class in 1933. Now, Johnson was a staff officer and a commander in what's called the 57th Infantry Regiment Scouts. These were Filipinos, Philippine professional soldiers serving as United States Army soldiers. And under the tutelage of professional officers and NCOs from the U.S. Army. So Johnson had been one of their key commanders, and now he is in the middle of the death march, the thirst, the privation, the cruelty, the mistreatment, all through it. All he can think about is his wife at home, Dorothy, whom he loved deeply. And he's just constantly got her in his mind, but also the other soldiers around him. Under that situation, a dog-eat-dog kind of situation, it didn't necessarily bring out the best in a lot of people. Stealing from one another, that kind of thing. Johnson was the exact opposite. The worse it got, the more ethical he became. Ethics equated to life and survival in his view. Leadership to him was about selflessness and professionalism, not glory. Johnson didn't care about glory. And as conditions grew worse, he became more honest somehow. More ethical and more spiritual. He'll later say of the Bataan Death March, God was very close and very real in those hours. The survivors, like Johnson, were consigned to Camp O'Donnell, one of the worst hellholes in the history of POWs in that same line. One of the leading scholars of it, a survivor of Camp O'Donnell, Colonel John Olson, will later write a book about it called Andersonville of the Pacific, and of course Andersonville is the infamous Civil War POW camp, and really that was not an exaggeration. For over 2 months, In 1942, Allied soldiers died in droves at Camp O'Donnell. Hundreds per day. Disease, thirst, starvation, occasional arbitrary beating or execution. The commandant, who was just this third grader, to give you a sense of this guy, he'd been through the Japanese military academy, and while his peers were, like full colonels, brigadier generals, he was still a captain. It gives you a sense of this guy. He says, he has this, the prisoners called it the GDU speech. I won't use nasty language, especially in a church. He says, "You are the eternal enemies of Japan. We will fight you and fight you and fight you for 100 years. And then he later says, "You have no ranks, you have no status. I don't care how many of you die, I hope more of you die." That's the kind of person you're dealing with here. What do you eat at Camp O'Donnell? Rice gruel, if that. Hardly anything else. You wait in line all day under a tropical sun for a canteen of water. There's like one water spigot for a camp of thousands. The Filipino compound is even worse. Chaos room, little leadership. There was as part of the medical setup, there was what was called the zero ward. And it got its nickname because you literally had zero chance to come out alive. Death was easier than life, one prisoner later reflected. It was as easy as letting go of a rope, and a lot of people quit hanging on. After surviving the death march, Johnson, a lieutenant colonel at this point, fell prey to malnutrition, terrible case of dysentery, so he did, and he ended up in the zero ward. And he was one of the very, very few to survive this hellish place. As he later put it, "I don't know why, I just know that I came out." Many others are less fortunate. 1,547 Americans and between 21 and 26,000 Filipinos died at Camp O'Donnell. 21 to 26,000. Americans, 1 in 6 fatality ratio. Filipinos, about 1 in 3. Survivors ended up at Cabanatuan POW camp, where the death rates persisted, not quite that high, but pretty high throughout much of the late summer and into the fall of 1942, until better organization, a bit more food, and medical care helped stabilize the conditions into merely poor rather than overtly deadly. And a major factor was, you guessed it, Johnson. Once Johnson came out of the zero ward, he plays a major role in the improvement by running a commissary. He was universally selected by his fellow prisoners because of his reputation for honesty and for consideration for others to collect their money and to purchase such necessities as food, medicine, and the like from the outside world, from Manila and other places to help the POW survive. So he pools this material and sees that it's distributed as fairly as possible. He sets up a charitable fund for those who didn't have money so that they would still have access to the extra food and medicine and the like. And he works productively with the Japanese. It's interesting. He's a student of human nature, and he's figured out how he can perhaps press their buttons the right way and get what he wants. He ingratiates himself with them. He builds trust. And I think this is the sort of irony of ironies. For all of his honesty, he's very happy to deceive them in odds. If it meant more food, more money, more medicine, more water, whatever, for the POWs. He does just that. He kept a diary. In his diary, he says, "My commissary business is booming." Scrawls it in his own hand in this diary. Many of the POWs kept diaries. His is fascinating. It's preserved in the National Archives and also just down the road in Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle. Really neat document to look at. And he writes in the format of like a letter to Dorothy, just telling her what's going on. Well, in this case, his commissary business was booming by 1942 and 43. I think it's fair to say, when conditions got a little better, he's one of the major reasons for it. And it's the beginning of, you're seeing it in the later picture here, as a 4-star general. He later became Army Chief of Staff in the 1960s. Okay, so beyond the POWs then, your strategic situation in the aftermath of the Philippines is, the Japanese conquered this empire here throughout much of the Pacific. They hope to hold on to it. They lose the Battle of Midway quite famously, and the Allies will begin counteroffensive. So you see the splitting up of the theater between Chester Nimitz, who has nominal control of much of what it's pointing at here, and of course the Southwest Pacific area under MacArthur, primarily New Guinea. And as you know, MacArthur's hope is to get, and mission in a way, is to get back to the Philippines someday, to liberate them. But I want to point out this, is that part of the same battle or campaign is the fight in New Guinea and more famously Guadalcanal. And the reason I say that is because the Japanese viewed it as such, and it's one of the reasons why they would lose because these battles go on concurrently and they're codependent, and the Japanese will end up sort of dispersing their resources too thinly, okay? And this is one of the things that leads to their detriment in both battles. One of the reasons why they will lose, especially at Guadalcanal. They're going to earmark and lose a lot of naval resources, of course, and a lot of troops, about 21 to 22,000 troops, who might have played a major role in New Guinea. The Americans had split it up into two different theaters. So the Army troops who fight at Guadalcanal, the 25th Infantry Division, so on and so forth, serve under Admiral William Halsey, who controls the South Pacific area. They don't serve under MacArthur. It's confusing, but that's how the Americans had sort of split up the theater. So the counteroffensive centers around trying to move beyond Port Moresby, which you see there, to the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. The Allies had used Australia as a base. The Australians have about 2/3 of the ground troops in play. The Americans just had 2 divisions there, the 32nd and the 41st. The 32nd will go into combat first in New Guinea. And they also now have burgeoning air power. And that's the key to this whole thing, of course. The 5th Air Force is going to have shuttle capacity that will allow you to move troops in New Guinea fairly well. And they're going to have air assets that are going to help destroy Japanese shipping and so on and so forth. Well, the hope is to capture Japanese bases on the northern coast of New Guinea, particularly one in a place called Buna, B-U-N-A. And this is what we would call, in the northern hemisphere, the fall of 1942. It's actually the opposite of the southern hemisphere, but just for the sake of clarity, we're talking about October, November 1942 here. And it's not going well. The Australians in the 32nd Division are bogged down in the mire of the terrible conditions you have in New Guinea. The jungles, the swamps, the mountains and ravines. Disease is a problem. Heavy Japanese resistance in fortified perimeters around Buna and another place called San Amanda and Gona, but Buna is the main place. So we're talking about where most of the Americans are going to do their fighting. So MacArthur is terrified that the Japanese are going to be able to hold on long enough to move naval resources and reinforcements here to reinforce the northern coast of New Guinea, move across New Guinea, capture Port Moresby and threaten Australia, and deal him another reversal that will ruin his career forever. He's already lost big time in the Philippines, yet he has this veneer of success. He knows he's not going to be able to withstand another disaster here. So as this thing starts to bog down at the end of November and early December 1942, MacArthur turns to a sort of fireman to get him out of this crisis. There he is. Let's go back just real quickly. You can see Papua New Guinea, you can see Buna, Jirua, Gona, okay, all the affected areas. You can see the movement, and that movement doesn't even describe how horrendous this was for the Allied soldiers getting across some of the roughest terrain in the world, but be that as it may, you're basically stalemated around these fortified perimeters here with not much change. So this guy, Robert Eichelberger, at that point a lieutenant general, West Point class in 1909. He and MacArthur had known each other for years. He had worked for MacArthur when MacArthur was chief of staff. Eichelberger had served in World War I, but not in the sort of conventional way like in Pershing's army in France. No, he had been part of the Polar Bear expedition of Allied troops who were sent to Russia to try and affect the Russian Civil War in such a way as to eliminate the Bolsheviks, and it turns into this long, protracted sort of quasi-disaster in the cold in Siberia and all the rest. But it allowed Eichelberger, by the way, to serve alongside and get some insight into the Japanese at that point in time. He'd served as an intel officer, he had served in a command capacity, he'd seen a lot of combat. Eichelberger had proven himself then to be a really adept, courageous officer. He had married a woman named Emma Gudger at this point, and if two people were ever like incredible soulmates, it's these two. They had no children. They had each other, this profound bond with each other, and it had Bob's career. So he wrote to her during the course of the war almost twice a day, like minimum once, but usually twice a day. Eichelberger is an historian's dream because it's just all there in his letters and later sort of notes that he keeps, the dictations he gives after the war. He writes about the war. He collects photographs. I mean, it's like he was a historian on site. And he himself had a great belief in learning from military history, as did MacArthur. So Eichelberger had come to the theater as the main American ground combat commander under MacArthur. And MacArthur says, all right, I want you to go to Buna and basically recover the situation there. And he famously tells Eichelberger in this briefing before he goes, he says, take Buna, Bob, don't come back alive. Eisenhower will later call MacArthur the greatest actor of all time, or he learned acting to food grades. I mean, MacArthur definitely had the dramatic flourish, but that tells you that he's getting kind of desperate. And so Eichelberger writes to Emma the night before he goes, he says, you may be sure that I shall always be with you in my thoughts. As I think all the years we've been together, I know you must realize how my admiration, respect, and love have increased. So, he arrives on December 1st to find this mess. What you're looking at here is a nice micro map of the Buna perimeter and the various Japanese fortifications and the like, and how this thing is still there. And he finds strong, interlocking Japanese log-reinforced bunkers on every avenue of approach. I mean, most of it's a swamp. So anywhere that you can actually walk on solid ground, they have it fortified with these bunkers. Poor supply situation. Soldiers are hungry. They've got maybe one sea ration per day. They're demoralized. The conditions are rotten. People have diseases. They got fever, inertia, lethargy. One officer described the troops as, quote, filthy, fever-ridden, practically starved, living in a tidal swamp. Eichelberger takes all this in, and the sort of awkward situation is that the division commander, the 32nd Division commander, was an old friend of his, a West Point classmate, Forrest Harding. They were good friends. And Eichelberger goes there with orders from MacArthur, relieve Harding. And Eichelberger's like, I'll hold off on that just till I see for myself what the situation is. But after he was there about a day and a half, he's finally like, Forrest, I'm sorry, I gotta let you go. This is inexcusable. Harding never forgave him, and it was really awkward at class of 1909 reunions, like for the rest of their lives. The Harding faction, the Eichelberger faction, Eichelberger screwed him over, and all this kind of stuff. But you know what? It's war. And someone's career doesn't matter. What matters is the lives of the soldiers who are right there. So Eichelberger sort of recovers the supply situation, one of the things that he felt he could not excuse of Harding. And so he reorganizes the whole front, resupplies these guys. He gets a sense of what kind of defenses he's dealing with. Quote, they were practically impenetrable to our fire, Sergeant Ernest Gerber said of the Japanese positions. You could look right into one and it looked like the jungle. An operations report stated, our troops could not fight as units, but rather as individuals in twos and threes. That was exactly it. So he tries this all-out attack, and it fails. And he decides there's no way we're going to be able to overwhelm this perimeter. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to back off, reorganize, and I'm just going to hit them in various parts of this perimeter. The sort of, have you ever heard the phrase, death by 1,000 cuts? It's like that. To sort of wear the Japanese down over time in these small unit actions. And by the way, he's not just in a command post back somewhere telling people to go do this. He's on the front lines almost every day. With a Tommy gun, with a carbine. He almost gets killed many times. Two key members of the staff get badly wounded, right next to him, have to be evacuated. Torrential rains are pouring down almost every day. He loses 30 pounds in a month. He writes to Emma once or twice a day, as much as time will permit. He later writes about the conditions that no one could remember when he went dry. The feet, arms, bellies, chests, armpits of my soldiers were hideously jumbled out. MacArthur's impatiently prodding him for final victory, issuing communiques that imply that he himself is at the front. In fact, he never once visited them. It became a kind of a ha-ha inside joke between Eichelberger and MacArthur for the rest of their lives when we fought together at Buna. MacArthur was back at Port Moresby. By the second half of December, though, the good news is the Japanese were in even worse shape because they hadn't been resupplied. They're hanging on in hopes of being resupplied. Why aren't they resupplied? Guadalcanal. Because of what's happening there. So these guys are dying, of disease and hunger, even as they're fighting the Americans who are constantly putting pressure on them. Sergeant Kiyoshi Wada tells his diary, what a discouraging and miserable state of affairs. Trees have fallen, limbs have been cracked, the hospital's in a horrible plight. What is going to happen to us? Another sadly wrote, every day my comrades die one by one and our provisions disappear. Many of the Japanese soldiers penned farewell letters to loved ones, knowing that these guys that they weren't going to get through the problem. He said, one guy says, I would like to write a few lines before I die. One soldier told his wife, you have a fine soul, one that is rare in this world. By chance you married unworthy me and you devoted yourself faithfully to me. I will always be grateful. However, your devotion to me will have been in vain, as I will soon die for our country. Just like that. Visibly. That was the mindset of these guys. So bit by bit, Eichelberger's troops gnaw away at these Japanese perimeters, overrunning them, starving them out, whatever. In these small unit actions, the fighting peters out by January 3rd, 1943. This is graphic, I apologize, but this is what it was like for those who were there. The Americans buried hundreds of the Japanese, and as Yank magazine correspondent Dave Richardson wrote, some are swollen yellow-green carcasses. Others are sun-bleached skeletons with tattered clothes covering their white bones. At the conclusion of the Battle of Buna, the United States has won its first ground battle victory in World War II. Eichelberger had won that victory, and again, I think that's kind of forgotten all these years later. I think that's kind of unfortunate. Granny St. MacArthur wanted all that for himself. I mean, there's no other way to explain it. He has a stormy session with Eichelberger in the aftermath of Buna because Eichelberger had spoken to reporters with MacArthur's permission, and they had written a lot of stories about him, and MacArthur didn't quite like that. He said, you know, well, I can press you down to Colonel and send you home. So Eichelberger got the message. He's like, oh, I'm going to zip my lip. I'm going to get along with this guy. You know, I'm not going to talk. He says later to a classmate who was in the PR division back in the War Department who was offering to generate some publicity, he said, I'd rather you slip a rattlesnake in my pocket. So yes, he quiets down, he goes back, he trains troops, he waits for the day when MacArthur will need him again later in the war, and of course that'll be in volume 2, hopefully you can read and buy sometime in the future. So, where are we in the aftermath of this? Well, you know, we're in this kind of place. New Guinea. With these victories in Papua New Guinea, we started to inherit this place. You've got to advance across the North New Guinea coast to get to the Philippines and beyond. And unfortunately, it's one of the most remote and undeveloped places on the planet. It's teeming with diseases. There's no infrastructure, crushing heat and humidity, overrun by jungles, mountains, swamps. Practically look at New Guinea, and you've got malaria. Horrible place to be. There's no good place to fight a war, but this is pretty bad. Yet the Allies needed to control, enough of New Guinea to continue the advance. So you had to solve this problem. The army is really fighting two battles, one against the enemy and the other against the jungle, wrote Lieutenant General Brian Somerville, head of Army Service Forces. Quite sagely, I think, around this time. The average annual rainfall in major portions of New Guinea that the Allies were trying to control was between 100 and 150 inches. Temperatures in the 90s and beyond. Humidity, 90% and beyond. Jungles, swamps, teeming with insects, environmental-borne diseases, so much so that I view the Pacific War as, to some extent, an interspecies war. A war against insects, a war against disease, a war against the environment. Some 54% of all hospital admissions for the Army were due to disease in 1943. In fact, the Army lost 5 men to malaria for every 1 that it was losing in combat against the Japanese that same year. That gave you a sense of the serious problems with disease. Fortunately, malaria was usually not fatal, but it was costly. 12,000 man days per month. The average malaria hospitalization was 25 days for the average soldier. The disease usually recurred, too, sometime later. More deadly was scrub typhus. A new strain of scrub typhus that was spread by mites in the New Guinea grass that had a 5% fatality rate. So the Allies were frantically trying to work out these problems and deal with the disease issue and the environment issues. By late 1943, 17 malaria control units had been deployed to New Guinea. So they had epidemiologists, entomologists, biologists trying to fight the problem. They sprayed insecticides. The soldiers at the time called them bug bombs. They stank to high heaven. You can imagine how toxic this stuff was. A bug bomb that goes off in your company perimeter and you clear out of it and it's supposed to get rid of the mosquitoes. Right? They flamed breeding areas, likely breeding areas, known breeding areas with diesel fires. But the real solution was pharmaceutical. Medics ruthlessly enforced regular doses of the drug called atabrine. Atabrine didn't necessarily cure the disease, it suppressed the symptoms, but this was good enough. But it had unfortunate side effects, occasional psychosis, not necessarily good in a drug, I would venture to say. Right? This is, of course, this is so typical of soldiers, I love it. The rumor soon spread that taking atabrine would make you sterile. no evidence of that. And you can imagine how tough that'd be to deal with as a commander. Oh, we promise it's not going to make you sterile. Yeah, right. It's too late then, all that kind of stuff. So sergeants have to ruthlessly make sure that their people took Atabrine. Most commonly, for white soldiers, it would yellow your skin. And so you could almost always tell a Pacific Theater veteran of that era by that kind of yellowish hue to their skin that sometimes persisted as much as 2 to 3 years. So life in New Guinea was hard and brutal, with almost no amenities, at least by American standards. Morale was low. One battalion commander wrote his wife, I think this is beautifully said, there are only 4 things that will keep soldiers happy: fighting, drinking, gambling, and women. In New Guinea, none were available, anything like the quantities the soldiers desired. So the soldiers tried to create their own alcohol, fermenting their own noxious jungle juice, as it was called. A nasty mix of fruit juice, raisins, potato peels, other detritus put together in this fermented liquid heap. It packed a powerful 100 to 180 proof wallop. Imagine that. It tastes real good. And this is according to record. This is not just me making this up, I promise. One fairly typical unit, about 1/3 of the men were not only usually too drunk to go on guard duty, but too drunk even to stand up. I'm guessing that's a problem, right? So what about sexuality? Well, severe cultural taboos are in place among American GIs. Any sort of discourse with local women in New Guinea, and most were not attractive to local women, whether white or black GIs, they really had very little interest. So your venereal disease rates are quite low. By contrast, in Australia, you have some units that have about a 1/3 infection rate by 1950. And it was becoming a real problem there. But in New Guinea, not as much of a problem, but you have massive sexual tension in theater because of the absence of women in almost any meaningful way. Do you have any women? We've got a few nurses in medical units, and they would be put under armed guards. Ostensibly to protect them from Japanese patrols, but really it was, quote, to discourage incidents of sexual harassment and fraternization, which is quite interesting, especially in light of 21st century issues along those lines. Another sign of the times, sad sign. Security tightened even more whenever African American units came into proximity with white nurses, as if black soldiers posed some sort of particular threat to the white nurses. The provost marshal spent thousands of man-hours and considerable resources to hunt down homosexuals, leading to the resignation of a chaplain and the official suspicion of one unnamed general. So there's this sort of, also in addition to that, this dark underbelly of depression, problem drinking, suicide, mental illness that festered among the troops. Neuropsychiatrists estimated that psychological problems, including psychosis and neuroses, affected between 5 and 10% of all American troops on New Guinea. In one extreme case, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Kinsler, commander of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, became so despondent that he committed suicide by shooting himself in the chest. And on a date with an Australian nurse, by the way. It's a terrible, terrible circumstance. What helps? Athletics. Athletics helped immensely. Wherever the Americans developed their bases on New Guinea, they soon established leagues for baseball, softball, football, volleyball, even ping pong. Boxing matches were common. Other forms of entertainment were common too. Outdoor theaters afforded a hugely welcome diversion for the soldiers. Occasional interruptions by heavy rain, or more commonly by enemy air raids, could not dissuade or dampen the enthusiasm for entertainment in the form of movies or live shows, the famous USO shows, that kind of thing too. Over a 3-month period at one typical base, soldiers at 43 different theaters took in 453 shows. Just gives you a sense of the sort of slice of life in one place. So, where does it end up? Well, Army logisticians, port battalions, quartermasters, the real unglamorous side of war, but really important sinews of war, worked veritable miracles to carve massive viable bases and ports out of the New Guinea wilderness. Remember, you got no infrastructure there. It's a civil engineer's nightmare, and yet they're making this work somehow, and I think this image shows you a lot. The largesse that's there, and the sort of some level of efficiency that comes out of all this. Allied armies on the island required 340,000 tons of material per month just to subsist. 340,000. Once landed, cargo degraded from the elements, insects, mold, animals, everything from blankets to medicine had to be protected, moved, and stored properly. By the end of 1943, Army engineers had constructed nearly 750 million square feet of warehouse storage space. And what gives you a sense of this is to look at previously barren places like Oro and Milne Bay. They turned into thriving bases like many American cities. The population of Oro Bay swelled to 50,000 soldiers in 1943. The base now had, wait for it, 125 miles of road, 8 operational runways, 35 bridges, multiple hospitals, and 8 docks. Milne Bay was even more developed. By the end of 43, it boasted 12 docks, 37 bridges, 130 culverts, 10 jetties, 20,000 feet of pipeline, plus stores and administration buildings. You brought sort of typical mundane American life to the New Guinea wilderness. MacArthur's theater, in the course of the war, received some 2.1 million measurement tons of material. Staggering quantity that absorbed so much naval and merchant shipping that the Army even maintained its own fleet of barges and cargo vessels, inevitably dubbed MacArthur's Navy. Well, where does that leave us by the end of 1943? Of course, an Allied counteroffensive, working through Southwest Pacific area, SWAPA, MacArthur's theater, Halsey here in the South Pacific, Nimitz, of course, throughout much of the rest of the Pacific. So you're seeing the Allies turn the tables on the Japanese. But I also wanted to mention just very briefly that the story of the Army in the Pacific is not just the story of MacArthur's theater, but Army troops are fighting under Halsey's tutelage, of course, here in the South Pacific, Guadalcanal later on, New Georgia in 1943. Of course, the invasion of Macon in the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, which is in Nimitz's theater, and the invasion of Attu, which is up here in Alaska, in the Aleutian Islands there. The 7th Infantry Division will assault that island in May 1943. And of course, I didn't even mention, and this is a big part of the book, of course, Joseph Stilwell's theater here in China, and Army engineers trying to build a road in Burma to have the supply link between China and the outside world, and there's significant resources invested toward that too. So it gives you a sense of the scale of it. So the Allies have turned the tables on the Japanese, and the quotients of air power, sea power, ground power, economic power, firepower were now all in their favor. So the Army has made a lot of mistakes. It still has plenty of deficiencies by this time, but it's maturing into a formidable force with effective leaders who've been tested under some pretty challenging circumstances, people like Eichelberg. So, in short, I believe it's fair to say this Army has become characterized by its fire and fortitude. Thank you.
I think I'm on. Thank you so much, John.
Sure.
We'd like to open it to a few questions and answers, if that's all right.
Yeah, let's do it.
We have questions back here. Kurt, do you have a microphone? Where's Kurt? Item. Here we go. Chris has it. Okay.
Thank you very much. My father-in-law fought in New Guinea, and he mentioned about the cannibals. Was that a problem too? But cannibals.
Cannibals?
Yeah.
It was something that in certain places you might have to watch out for. Yeah. Because what's happening is you're seeing it. I didn't even mention this, but there's a tendency, the Americans and also the British and Australians, to just dismiss locals as, quote, natives or whatever. Well, you're talking about people with distinct cultures and heritage and tribes, many of them have had no contact with the outside world, including some cannibal tribes. And so, the Allies had to deal with diplomacy with them, and in many cases, enlisting them for this large labor and logistical effort to help in that regard. So the Allies, actually, one of the reasons why they win the war is they were much more successful at this than were the Japanese, who tended to treat the locals much more harshly. So yes, it doesn't surprise me here that your father-in-law mentioned cannibals, because that would have been, for some people in some spots in New Guinea, an issue.
And for just one more thing, he said I think he was surrounded by the Japanese for about 60 days. And all he had was as far as coconuts and water to drink and eat for about 60 days. And I'm not sure what outfit he was in.
just from hearing that, this is only my guess, but I suspect maybe he served in 1944 on what's called the Drennymore River.
44.
Yeah.
He was from Pennsylvania, but he was in Alabama, battalion or some division from Alabama. So does that make any sense?
You have a division called the Dixie Division. It was
Yes.
the 31st Infantry Division. That
That's
served
where
in wartime.
he was in that.
Yeah, they invaded wartime, September 1944.
44.
Yeah, and that'll be in the next book. I keep
Well, I'll find your first book, so I have to wait for the second book now.
All right.
Thank you.
I think we had somebody over here. There we go.
You mentioned the Battle of Midway. Could you elaborate on that and also the role that African American soldiers played in the Pacific?
Yeah, Midway, of course, happens in June 1942, and what makes it significant is the Allies, who had been sort of outclassed initially in terms of naval tonnage and naval aviation experience and the like at the beginning of the war. Midway becomes the equalizer for the Americans. They inflict significant damage on the Imperial Japanese Navy fleet, sinking fort carriers, of course. This brings a level of parity that is very detrimental to the Japanese because over time the Americans are going to be able to build a lot more shipping, a lot more fleet carriers and the like, and it helps buy time for that. It stops the expansion of Japanese arms eastward. It led to the showdown engagement that Admiral Yamamoto had famously wanted while Japan still had the advantage. Japan sort of loses that opportunity. They lose some of their best naval aviators too, and certainly that has an effect later in the war. African American GIs have an enormous contribution to the war, to the whole war, but especially the war in the Pacific. And an example I'll give you that I didn't get a chance to elaborate on much tonight is the building of the road in Burma, which is under some of the most horrific conditions you could possibly imagine. Especially if you're all in like the civil engineering world or whatever. Just study that sometime and imagine trying to cut a road out of wilderness, mountain, nothing, with like one bulldozer. You know, just and African American engineers comprise about 2/3 of the manpower for that. And elsewhere, Australia, port battalions, and you know these are racially segregated units that are coming up against the Australian culture now too. And the irony of ironies, really sad and tragic in irony, is that they're more accepted by white Australians than they are by their own white countrymen in some cases. Check out, for instance, something called the Townsville Riot, in which African American soldiers sort of revolted and began shooting at their own officers, and it was a really bad situation. Later on, you have a Japanese combat, or an African American combat unit thrown into a battle against the Japanese at Bougainville, the 93rd Infantry Division. And I think this is one of the real corrosive byproducts of Jim Crow segregation and racism in the country, because it's a segregated combat unit under white and a few black officers. And so you have them, as all these eyeballs are on these guys, people with an agenda of one side or the other. And so in a way, they're not going to get any fair shake as a combat unit like most do go. Like the 32nd Division had a rough time initially at Buna, but eventually they get guys, and it's a really good unit. The 93rd doesn't have that ability to learn, out of the microscope. And so when they're in some of their first initial actions, those who are on their side want to make it seem like they're the greatest unit in the army. Those who are against them, any flaw, it's like, oh, I told you, they won't fight. And they have a bad patrol, and then it ends up as this politically toxic thing. So if you're an African American GI in the Pacific, you're probably used in a support role, probably an engineering role, some sort of building, construction, and port battalions too.
Great. Have any more questions? Over here. I'll work my way over. Where's Chuck Klein? Is he here?
Right there.
He's right here. I have to tell you, this afternoon I surprised Chuck and I brought John to visit him. Chuck served on 4 invasions in the South Pacific, and to listen to these guys speak for 1 hour was absolutely amazing.
It was an honor.
My questions are over here. Well, I just told these guys I'd be over there in a second, but I saw Chuck Klein, so I'll be back. Who had the questions over here? Oh, Colonel. What a surprise.
I was always impressed by the early commitment of National Guard divisions in the Pacific. Can you comment on that and how they performed?
Yeah, and the best example is the two that are involved in New Guinea in 1942 to 43. The 32nd Infantry Division, which of course fights at Buna. is a National Guard unit primarily from northern Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin area. And they had initially thought they were going to the European theater. I've always thought this is so funny, and again, forgive me, so Army, because these are guys who grew up in a cold weather environment, you know, that's their world, and of course, let's send them to the South Pacific where it's 95 degrees and 90+% humidity. You know, that's just, you know, the exigencies of war, right? So this unit is very well trained, but not necessarily for what they're going to have to do at Buna. And so they're going to have to improvise and learn about really small unit action combat of, okay, well, the terrain dictates that only 3 or 4 guys can get in this fight at any length at any given moment in time. So we're going to have to figure out how to operate in those kind of units productively and deal with these pillboxes and deal with the swamps and how we're going to supply them and all that. I think, especially once Eichelberger comes along, the 32nd ends up as a really strong unit, but they pay a terrible price. It's about a year or so of refitting after Buna before they could be sent back into combat. The other division that's in play is the 41st Infantry Division, which is from the Pacific Northwest. They're going to be at Sanananda, and they're going to be in some of the less glamorous fighting that happened deeper in 1943 alongside the Australians. Once again, you see some issues with not necessarily understanding how to do jungle patrolling and all that, but they innovate and they learn pretty well. So I believe personally, this is just my opinion, I think the National Guard units that fight in the whole war, but especially in the Pacific, do really quite well considering the circumstances.
I spent 28 and a half years as a U.S. Marine Infantry officer, and you've written a great book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next book. Could you briefly compare and contrast the cooperation between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy in the South Pacific and Southwest Pacific, and compare and contrast to the Japanese Army and Navy cooperation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for your service, sir. Certainly there's a great rivalry between the Army and the Navy, and it doesn't always, work to the advantage of the United States and the Allied strategic position in the Pacific theater. And I think an example is MacArthur's attitude towards Nimitz, whom he sees as a competitor for resources, and he will try to kind of undercut him. He's constantly blustering to Washington about how they're not supporting him and this, that, and the other thing. MacArthur's not thinking about being a team player with the Navy until he really sits down with Admiral Halsey. MacArthur had bad experiences with the Navy in the Philippines in 1941-42, what was called the Asiatic Fleet under Admiral Thomas Hart. And the dynamic in play there, you may not know this about MacArthur, but he was the younger of 2 brothers. His older brother was a naval officer, an up-and-coming naval officer with a great career who dies of all things of appendicitis at the age of 38 or 39. And Admiral Thomas Hart, eventually Admiral Thomas Hart, had been a friend of MacArthur's brother who had died. And so he knew Douglas as this, full of you-know-what kid brother, and so he didn't take him as seriously as everybody was supposed to take MacArthur seriously. So the dynamic was not good there. And MacArthur felt Hart had betrayed him by skedaddling his fleet instead of fighting to extinction against the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Philippines. So he comes out of that experience thinking, oh, the Navy's useless, but it's like, if you're going to do anything in the Pacific, you better work well with the Navy and you better harness those resources. When he meets Halsey, whose father is also a naval officer and who had known MacArthur's father, they get along famously. And it's at that point that MacArthur really starts to work well with the Navy. And I think that the same is to a great extent true with most of the division commanders you're going to see under Nimitz, the 7th Division, the 27th Division, naming a division. Most of them are going to tend to work pretty well with their naval colleagues. By contrast, the Japanese, if you think the rivalry between the Americans and the Navy and the Army is bad, between the Japanese, it's incredibly toxic. And one of the reasons why is the 2 Japanese services want different wars. The Imperial Japanese Army wants the war on the Asian continent against China. That's where they see as the South or Japan's paucity of resources and whatever else. So they want war there, and they've got it, hadn't they? But the Navy also gets what they want, which of course is the larger domination of the Pacific Ocean against the European powers of the United States. And the capture of resources in what was called the Dutch East Indies then, now it's called Indonesia. So they didn't always want to cooperate, and they often hated each other. They represented different political components of Japanese life, and that is a real problem for the Japanese war effort throughout all of the Pacific War, much more so than the problems on the Allied side. And the Allied side is considerable. Right? It's child's play compared to the Japanese, in my opinion.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, sure.
Just, am I correct in understanding that most, for example, under Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Peninsular, they were a Marine invasion? Am I correct in that or not?
Yeah, Guadalcanal was initially a Marine invasion, 1st Marine Division on August 7, 1942.
When I was young, that would be on the newsreel. You would see it, a lot of explosion, a lot of, very exciting. Well, some of the other, for example, going over the hump, that kind of thing, building the roads, not as exciting, and so you really didn't think in terms of the Army. One of the reasons that I was surprised that you're saying that the Army took so much more casualties than actually the Marines did.
Because there were just more of them.
Yeah.
More soldiers.
Yeah, and then strategically, taking those islands allowed us to specifically attack Japan.
Exactly.
And in the war.
And the thing about it is that there are very few exclusively Marine battles. And I think that's sometimes what we tend to forget. Like Guadalcanal starts out, yes, that's a Marine invasion, but then the Army's 25th Infantry Division comes ashore, the Americal, other portions of the 2nd Marine Division, and they all fight together. So when you talk about exclusive Marine battles, you're pretty much talking about Tarawa and Iwo Jima. Most of the rest are partnerships between the Army and the Marine Corps. And so one of the things that I try to stress in this book and the next is that the two ground-oriented services are partners. They are brothers and sisters in this sense. And they really ought to look at it that way and look what happens when they work and coordinate well together and what happens when they don't.
Last month, our speaker was a tanker, and he and a German were firing at the same car. They weren't sure who actually killed this person. They eventually, the German was taken prisoner, and he ended up in France. And from what he was saying about his experience, that he was fed very little. As a matter of fact, our prisoners, the German prisoners, were not, there were so many, they were not treated well insofar, especially with food. So what they did with this particular person, they allowed him to work in the kitchen. And they still didn't feed him. But what happened was, the cooks were black. And he was finding out that they were leaving little bits of food on their plates for him to clean, and then he could eat it. And when he asked them, why are they doing this? What the black cook said, you're the number 1 prisoner. We're the number 2 prisoner. And what a asset that was so underutilized.
Absolutely.
They were probably draftees, but to have that and to say that, to a German,
Yeah, right.
pretty poignant.
Very poignant. Yeah, as you probably know, many African Americans in World War II talked about double V. V was for victory over the Axis powers, but victory over Jim Crow, racism, segregation, and all. Yeah, great point.
Thank you. Did I miss one over here or something? Oh, way over. All right, I'm on my way.
I enjoyed the vignettes about the leaders and all those were interesting. I was really not aware of all the Army and theater getting and all that. I was curious about, as you alluded to, the battles which were many of us are more familiar, in which the Marines might be initially and then the Army was their addition. Can you talk a little bit more about the situations where in the more famous areas where it was a combination of Marine and Army units and how there was differences, similarities? And then also I was intrigued with all your bashing of MacArthur. I'm going to ask you to take the opposite of Jack and comment on the island hopping strategy, which he's credited with. And then basically give him a minute of props, whether you like it or not.
A lot to cover. Yeah, Guadalcanal, of course, is the prime example of Marines and soldiers fighting alongside each other under very productive terms. And I go into that in great depth in this book, actually. But so yeah, there you have 1st Marine Division. Go and take the airfield, set up the perimeter, hold on against ferocious Japanese attacks, reinforced by Americal, 25th Division, so on and so forth. This kind of sets the pattern a little bit. One of the examples later in the war I would give you is Bougainville, which isn't that well known, but the 3rd Marine Division assaults it in November 1943, carves out an enclave, and then it leaves, and 2 Army divisions, the Americal and the 37th, come in, hold this perimeter, and the Japanese decide, we want it all back. And they launch this massive banzai attack in March 1944. You know, the most famous Marine battles, I think it's fair to say, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, of course, Okinawa is, I think, perhaps the prime example of Army and Marine troops fighting shoulder to shoulder against a pretty potent enemy. So by that point in the war, you have enough commanders in place on both sides who understand how to work together productively. And so I really think that's the sort of larger takeaway.
When they work together, such as now, is there a difference in the overall Marine way of learning, Army way of learning, not so much?
Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot about that to this day, and I'm about like the Marine way of fighting, the Army way of fighting. Marines supposedly straight on, you know, take the objective, suffer a lot of losses so that you win a quicker victory and don't suffer as many in the long term. Army more deliberate, slower pace, using all your combined arms and all that. I do think there's a whiff of truth to that, but I will tell you, as an historian of combat in World War II, really looking at the sort of cutting edge of riflemen and machine gunners and whatever, I really think they're pretty similar in how they fight. It's just, and that's only my opinion. And I think that's really swimming against the tide of what is sort of the conventional wisdom among many historians. A good example I'll give you is Saipan, where, of course, 2 Marine divisions fight alongside 1 Army division. And if you study like the small unit actions, it's pretty similar how they fight. And both well, in my view, both really well.
John, I'm going to take one more question
Okay.
from a fellow served on the Wasatch. Do you know that ship?
Oh, yeah.
Command ship, MacArthur?
Yeah, I know the gentleman.
It's Chuck Klein. You spent time with him today, and I think he wants to either ask a question or thank you for a wonderful afternoon.
Oh.
But I wonder, you mentioned about the uncomfortableness of the troops and the people, but the Navy, you know, we were out on the ship and learning the swamps and things like that, but I can remember being a Higgins boat driver, we were up in our boat when we dived, and when the deck crews came up, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, in Milne Bay and Hollandia and Mordecai, it was 108 to 116 degrees already, and as they were swabbing the decks, we were up there looking down and you could hardly see them because of the steam that was coming up off the deck. So when you talk about being uncomfortable, when you went below deck, in there in the air conditioning, all they had was fans, and the fans was blowing hot air all around.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you like your crow's nest position, didn't you? You were up there.
The heat is the heat, isn't it? Yep.
I have 2 things. First and foremost,
Okay.
the
Come
most,
down to you.
if you'd like.
Come down to your level. All right.
That's pretty good. This is it's a privilege saying the most illustrious that we give out. They're very rare. We only give them to special people.
I feel very special. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I had the great pleasure of spending the day with John, and I asked him if he'd come back and speak on his letter book, The Dead, Those About to Be. So we'll put that down in the future, and we wish you'd come back.
I'd be honored. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, he's going to be signing books for people who want to buy his books. He's going to be giving you that special signature, and we look forward to it. Thank you.
Have a good hearing.